There is a level of wealth in this world that does not show up on Instagram. It does not ride past you on the highway. It does not walk into a club and buy out the bar so everybody knows it is there. This kind of wealth sits behind water, behind gates, behind layers of privacy so thick that the people on the outside can only guess at what is on the other side. And right now, fam, we are about to step through those gates. Because the man behind one of the most untouchable empires in the history of hip-hop has been living a life so far beyond what most people imagine that even the rumors sound like they came from a movie. We are talking about a man who did not just get rich off music. We're talking about someone who built a structure, an actual empire that has been generating wealth and power and influence for over 30 years. They say he owns an island off the coast of Miami. They say the compound cannot be seen from the street or the water. They say the jewelry collection alone would make most people's heads spin. And the cars are just the beginning of what is sitting behind those walls. Fam, what we're about to get into today is not your average celebrity lifestyle breakdown. This is bigger than that. This is the story of how Brian "Birdman" Williams turned a label out of New Orleans into one of the most powerful business structures in the music industry. And then took all of that money and built a life in Miami that the rest of the world can barely even picture. The shocking truth behind this empire is more layered, more calculated, and more impressive than anyone gives him credit for. And we are about to reveal it all. Yo, what is good, fam? Welcome back. Today we are going all the way inside Birdman's massive Miami empire, and we are going to cover everything. The label, the deal that changed the game, the artists he launched into orbit, the net worth estimates, a lifestyle, and yes, we are getting into the island. Let's get into it. Now, before we go any further, let me keep it 100 with y'all. There is a lot of noise out there when it comes to Birdman. Some of it is documented history. Some of it is mythology that he earned by living a certain kind of life at a certain kind of level for decades. And some of it is rumor that took on a life of its own. Because when someone is private enough and wealthy enough, the imagination fills in the gaps. But yo, we are about to separate the facts from the fiction, the real from the fake, and give you the full picture of what this man actually built and how he actually lives. Because here is the thing, the island talk, the Miami compound energy, the idea that Birdman exists in a world that regular people simply cannot access. None of that came from nowhere. It came from a man who understood from the very beginning that in this industry, ownership is everything and privacy is power. Hold up though, before y'all start thinking this is just another story about a rapper who got a big check and bought a bunch of stuff, that is not what this is. What Birdman built is structurally different from almost anything else in hip-hop history. But here's where it gets real spicy, because to understand the empire, we have to go back to where it started. So check it. 1991. New Orleans, Louisiana. That is the date and the place that changed everything, not just for Brian Williams, but for the entire business model of independent hip-hop. Now in the industry, we know that the major labels held all the cards back then. Distribution, promotion, radio, all of it ran through systems that the big corporations control. And if you were an independent label trying to get your music heard outside your city, you were basically at their mercy. But Birdman's situation was different, because he and his brother Ronald "Slim" Williams were not waiting for permission. They built Cash Money Records from the ground up in New Orleans, and from day one, they operated like people who understood that the goal was not just to make music, the goal was to own it. Brian Williams was born in New Orleans in 1969, and if you know anything about that city, you understand that it has always had a musical culture unlike anywhere else in America. Second lines, brass bands, the blues, bounce music. New Orleans had been generating distinctive sounds for generations, but the mainstream music industry had largely looked past the city when it came to hip-hop. That gap, that underserved regional market, became the opportunity. Cash Money in the early years was pressing up physical product, distributing through local networks, building a fan base city by city and block by block through authenticity and proximity rather than corporate budgets. That's some real determination right there. Because what Birdman and Slim were doing was not glamorous. It was work. It was the kind of work that teaches you every aspect of how a music business actually functions. Because when you are doing everything yourself, you learn everything. And that education, that ground level understanding of how the machine operates, would become the foundation for one of the most significant business negotiations in independent music history. But here's where it gets interesting, because through the mid-1990s, Cash Money started building its identity and its roster into something that had real regional weight. The label was moving product, developing artists, and generating the kind of local momentum that attracts larger attention. And by the late 1990s, that attention arrived in the form of a conversation with Universal Records. A conversation that would produce a deal the music industry is still talking about. Now let me break down for y'all why the Cash Money and Universal Distribution Agreement, which came together in 1998, was such a major moment. Distribution is the infrastructure that gets music from a recording studio into the ears of people around the world. Before streaming, that meant physical distribution into stores. After streaming, it meant placement on platforms and promotional infrastructure. Either way, without distribution, even great music struggles to reach its potential audience. The major labels had historically used their control of distribution as leverage to demand ownership of masters, publishing rights, and long-term control over an artist's catalog. The most valuable long-term assets in music. What Cash Money negotiated was access to Universal's distribution power without surrendering those ownership structures. Reports from the time placed the value of the arrangement in the range of $30 million in advances, and while the specific terms of any corporate contract have layers of complexity that do not always make it into public reporting, the headline was unmistakable. Birdman and Slim Williams had sat across the table from one of the most powerful entertainment corporations on the planet and walked away with a deal that kept their catalog intact. Let that sink in for a minute. In 1998, when most independent labels were being absorbed or dismantled by major label machinery, Cash Money kept the keys to its own house. That is not a small thing. That is the move that made everything else possible. Now the business foundation was locked in. But fam, a label is only as powerful as the artists on it. And this is where the Cash Money story goes from impressive business case study to full-on cultural history. Because while Birdman was constructing the business infrastructure, Cash Money was also developing an artist who would become one of the most important voices in the history of hip-hop. The real tea that got everybody shook is that Dwayne Michael Carter Jr., Lil Wayne, had been connected to Cash Money since he was literally a child. He was calling the label's phone line as a preteen, rapping for anyone who would listen. And eventually Birdman and Slim Williams signed him when he was barely a teenager. Now, the full story of Lil Wayne's relationship with Cash Money is complicated, and the public disputes that emerged later between Wayne and the label became some of the most watched drama in the industry. But from a pure business and cultural standpoint, what Cash Money did with Lil Wayne was build one of the most valuable artist brands in the history of rap music. Through the late 1990s and across the 2000s, Wayne became a force of nature, not just a rapper, but a measuring stick, a cultural reference point, a presence so dominant that the entire industry organized itself around what he was doing. Every unit sold, every tour dollar generated, every licensing fee and publishing royalty and merchandise revenue that Lil Wayne's career produced flowed through the Cash Money infrastructure. That is leverage. That is the kind of asset that compounds over time and produces wealth at multiple levels simultaneously. But yo, this is where the story gets deeper than just one artist's success. Because as Cash Money moved into the 2000s and its influence expanded, the label became a launching pad for careers that would themselves become global empires. Drake, who would go on to become arguably the most commercially dominant rapper of the entire streaming era, spent a formative period connected to Cash Money through Young Money, the imprint that Lil Wayne established under the Cash Money umbrella. Nicki Minaj, one of the most successful female artists in the history of hip-hop, came up through that same ecosystem. The cultural and financial footprint of what Birdman had built extended outward through these connections in ways that multiplied the reach of the operation far beyond what any single artist could generate alone. Cash Money was not just a record label anymore. It was a system, a machine for identifying talent, developing it, monetizing it across music and touring and publishing and brand partnerships, and sending the revenue back through an ownership structure that Birdman had insisted on protecting from the very beginning. Now, let's talk about what all of that actually produced in terms of wealth. The real kicker, fam, is that when you look at the public estimates around Birdman's net worth, the numbers are significant, and the sources behind them are even more significant than the numbers themselves. Various outlets and industry observers over the years have placed his fortune in the high 8-figure to low 9-figure range, with estimates frequently referencing figures in the vicinity of $100 million. Now, it is important to be straight with y'all about what net worth estimates for private individuals actually represent, because those figures carry real uncertainty when the subject has not disclosed their finances publicly. What we can do is look at the structural sources of value that make those estimates credible. The Cash Money music catalog, accumulated across decades of recordings during one of hip-hop's most commercially dominant eras, is a substantial asset. And here is the part that a lot of people do not fully understand. Music catalogs have become one of the most aggressively valued asset classes in all of entertainment finance over the past decade. Investors have been paying enormous multiples for ownership stakes in proven catalogs because the royalty streams they generate are predictable, recurring, and long-term. A label that owns masters from the late 1990s and 2000s era of Cash Money's commercial peak is sitting on something whose value increases over time, especially in the streaming era, when older recordings from beloved artists get more listening than they ever did on physical formats. Add to that the ongoing label operations, publishing interests, licensing revenues, real estate exposure in one of the most expensive markets in the country, and the long-term business relationships that Birdman has cultivated across 30-plus years in the industry. And the picture that comes together is not a rapper who had a good run. It is a businessman who made structural decisions at key moments that position him to capture value at every level of the music industry simultaneously. For those who know the culture, that kind of financial architecture is rare. For those who are just getting up to speed, this is what separates an empire from a career. Now let's talk about how that empire gets expressed on the outside. Because while the business structure is impressive on paper, Birdman also built something that people could see, feel, and react to. A lifestyle so outsized and so carefully constructed that it became its own cultural statement. The name Stunnerman was not an accident. It was a declaration. And for people who have been watching hip-hop culture over the last 2 decades, the image that name represents is instantly recognizable. The jewelry. Let's start there. Birdman's jewelry collection became legendary in a culture where jewelry has always been a language, a visual communication of success, of arrival, of refusal to be small. Oversized chains, custom diamond pieces, watches that cost more than most people's homes, all worn with the kind of ease that only comes from having transcended the point where any of it feels like a stretch. The cars followed the same logic at an even larger scale. Bugattis, Lamborghinis, Maybachs, custom configurations that did not leave the factory looking the way they looked by the time Birdman was done with them. Because standard production means something was designed for everyone, and Birdman's whole aesthetic was built around the opposite of that. The travel, the entourage, the events, the sheer density of luxury that followed him wherever he went. All of it was intentional. All of it was the physical manifestation of what years of ownership and hustle and strategic thinking had produced. Real talk, the lifestyle was part of the brand, and the brand was part of the business. Now let's talk about Miami, because this is where the story takes on a dimension that goes beyond jewelry and cars, and into something that carries a different kind of weight entirely. Birdman did not just choose Miami as a place to spend money. He chose it as a place to build a world. And Miami, for people who understand what the city represents at its highest levels, is not simply a location. It is a philosophy. It is a culture of waterfront living, of private access, of boat channels and barrier islands and real estate that exists in a category where the price tag is almost beside the point. Because what you are actually paying for is separation from everything else. Star Island, Fisher Island, the private compounds along the Intracoastal Waterway, where the neighbors are other billionaires and the security is designed to be invisible and the privacy is absolute. This is the Miami that exists beyond the clubs and the South Beach energy and the tourist economy. This is the Miami where you arrive by water and the world behind you disappears. And this is the Miami where Birdman built his presence. The mythology around a private island, around a compound that cannot be photographed from the street or the water, around a level of waterfront access so complete and so exclusive that it functions less like a home and more like a sovereign territory. That mythology was not invented by people with overactive imaginations. It was cultivated by a lifestyle that consistently pushed toward the outer edges of what money can actually purchase, which in Miami means purchasing distance from the world. The street's been talking about Birdman's Island for years, and whether that conversation maps onto a single, specific, documented property or reflects the cumulative impression of a life built around maximum exclusivity, the cultural reality of it is the same. Birdman positioned himself in a tier of Miami living that the general public experiences only as rumor and myth. Now let's be clear about the distinction here, because this is where we have to be honest with y'all. There is a difference between verified documented property ownership, the luxury lifestyle that is publicly observable, and the mythology that grows up around someone who is both extremely wealthy and extremely private. What the record shows is consistent investment in South Florida real estate and a waterfront lifestyle that communicates elite access at every level. What the mythology adds, the island, the untouchable compound, the idea that not even a photograph can capture what he has built, is the natural result of a public image built around total exclusivity over many years. That mythology is powerful. It is part of the brand, and it is not entirely disconnected from reality, because the lifestyle that generates it is real, even if every specific detail has not been independently verified. For y'all who might not understand how this works in the world of ultra-high net worth real estate, let me explain. The most exclusive properties in Miami are deliberately kept out of the public record as much as legally possible. They are held through corporate structures, trusts, and LLCs designed specifically to prevent casual public knowledge of ownership. So the absence of a public deed and a famous name does not mean the absence of ownership. It often means the opposite. When people talk about the luxury assets connected to Birdman's image over the years, the inventory extends well beyond the visible flash. Waterfront real estate in one of the world's most competitive and expensive markets. Recording spaces built not just for function, but for an experience that reflects the aesthetic of someone who long ago transcended the limitations of a rented studio hour. Custom interiors designed around privacy, comfort, and the kind of specificity that only emerges when money has stopped being a constraint, and the only question remaining is what you actually want. Entertainment spaces built for a circle of people who do not need to go anywhere, because the best version of everything can be brought to them. And vehicles. We have to come back to the vehicles, some of which exist as one-of-one configurations because the conversation with the manufacturer started with words like, "I want something that does not exist in any catalog." The aggregated picture of these assets is not a collection of expensive things. It is a declaration. It is the physical architecture of an empire that has been built over decades by a man who understood that the point of building wealth is not to prove it to strangers, but to live inside it completely. Now let me get more specific, because the details here matter. Birdman's car collection over the years has been documented publicly enough that we can talk about it with real specificity. We are talking about a Bugatti Veyron, one of the most expensive and exclusive production vehicles ever built. A car that in its stock form costs well over $1 million and in a customized configuration costs considerably more. We are talking about a Rolls-Royce Phantom with interior customization that turned an already extraordinary vehicle into something that exists in a category by itself. Lamborghinis, multiple of them, in colorways and configurations that reflected a taste for vehicles that announce themselves before they are even fully visible. A custom Maybach, a Ferrari collection, and beyond the individual vehicles, the sheer scale of the collection, the fact that at any given time there are multiple seven-figure automobiles sitting in climate-controlled spaces, communicates something that a single car never could on its own. It communicates permanence. It communicates that this is not a phase or a moment of success being celebrated. This is a standard of living that has been sustained over time. The jewelry tells the same story with different materials. Birdman's pieces have included full diamond face watches from brands that most people have never heard of because the brands that most people know are not operating at the level he shops at. Custom pendants, chains with price tags that would purchase a comfortable home in most American cities. Rings stacked across multiple fingers simultaneously. Each one a statement on its own, all of them together functioning as a kind of wearable catalog of what accumulated wealth looks like when it is expressed without hesitation. Real talk, in hip-hop culture, jewelry has always been a language, and Birdman has been speaking that language at a volume that very few people in the history of the culture have matched. But here is what really separates Birdman's story from most celebrity wealth narratives, and this is the analysis that matters most if you are actually trying to understand what he built. The real kicker is that most visible celebrity wealth is income-based. It flows in from performances, from endorsements, from appearance fees and brand deals. And it flows back out through a lifestyle that at the upper levels of celebrity spending can consume enormous amounts very quickly. The machine that produces the income and the machine that consumes it are running simultaneously. And the question is always whether production is outrunning consumption. What Birdman built is architecturally different from that model. When you own masters, you own a royalty stream that continues generating revenue for as long as people listen to those recordings. When you own publishing rights, you own income that flows every time a song is performed, licensed, placed in a film or television show, or covered by another artist. When you own the label itself, the actual corporate entity, you own a percentage of every revenue stream that flows through its operations. These are not income streams. These are assets. And assets compound over time in ways that income cannot replicate. The fact that Birdman secured those ownership structures in 1998, when the music industry operated very differently than it does today, means he was holding assets that will become dramatically more valuable as the streaming economy restructured the entire business from the ground up. That is not luck. That is the result of a negotiating position informed by years of independent operation, and an absolute refusal to be dazzled by the size of a check when the real value was sitting in the ownership rights attached to it. In the hood, we know the difference between getting paid and getting ownership. Now let's talk about how Birdman actually moves today, because the public profile has changed significantly from the peak Cash Money years, and that change itself tells a story worth understanding. The era of maximum visibility, the events, the red carpets, the constant presence in music videos and on award show stages and in the kind of content that kept his image in constant circulation, has given way to something quieter and more insular. He is still active, the business infrastructure is still operating, the catalog is still generating, the real estate is still appreciating. The investments and long-term positioning that were built over decades have not evaporated simply because the public appearances have become less frequent. What has changed is the mold. The energy has shifted from projection to consolidation, from the loudness of a man announcing his arrival to the stillness of a man who has already arrived and no longer needs to announce anything to anyone. And that shift is not a retreat. It is an upgrade. It is the difference between a man who is building wealth and a man who is living inside wealth that has already been built. The private dinners, the closed-door meetings, the conversations that happen on boats and in rooms that do not have photographers in them. That is where Birdman operates now. And in the world of Miami's most exclusive communities, that stillness is its own status signal, possibly the most powerful one available. The people who are genuinely operating at the highest levels of wealth in that city do not require constant visibility. They do not need cameras or headlines or public demonstrations, because their wealth is not performing for an audience. It is simply there, structured and insulated and compounding quietly behind the kind of privacy that only comes with the resources to actually maintain it. The mystique has never faded. And honestly, fam, it probably never will. You still hear Birdman's name in conversations about the wealthiest people in hip-hop. You still see the island talk circulate every time someone puts together a list of the most extraordinary lifestyles in the culture. You still feel the weight of what Cash Money represented, not just as a record label, but as a proof of concept, as evidence that the infrastructure of the major music industry can be navigated on your own terms if you were patient enough, strategic enough, and unwilling to accept the first version of the deal that crossed the table. And you still see the blueprint he drew in New Orleans in 1991, showing up in the conversations that young artists and entrepreneurs are having today about ownership, independence, and what it actually means to build something that does not depend on anyone else's permission to survive. The culture remembers. And the culture keeps coming back to this story because it is one of the few that actually holds up under scrutiny. The deeper you look, the more impressive it gets. At the end of the day, the reason Birdman's story keeps pulling people in is not one car or one chain or even one island. It is something much deeper than any of those things. It is the fact that here was a man from a city the industry was largely overlooking, who built something from nothing alongside his brother, who educated himself through years of independent grinding, who sat across from one of the biggest corporations in entertainment and protected the most valuable parts of what he owned, and who then used that foundation to launch careers accumulate assets, and build a life in Miami that operates at an altitude the outside world can only speculate about. The empire is not one thing. It is the accumulated result of 30+ years of decisions made with the consistent understanding that wealth without ownership is temporary, and that the real power in the music business has always belonged to the people who control the catalog, not just the people whose names appear on the cover. That is the Birdman blueprint. That is the Miami Empire. And whether the island is a documented property, a private compound sitting behind water and gates in total silence, or a piece of mythology built brick by brick through decades of exclusivity and calculated privacy, the story it represents is entirely and undeniably real. What are your thoughts on Birdman's legacy and the empire he built? Drop your take in the comments below and tap the video on screen right now for more stories from inside hip-hop's biggest empires.